Leonardo DiCaprio played him as a teenage genius who forged $2.5 million in checks, flew as a fake Pan Am pilot, posed as a doctor and a lawyer, and outran the FBI across 2 continents, all before he turned 21. A journalist spent 4 years with prison records, court files, and newspaper archives, and reached a very different conclusion. Most of that never happened. Not exaggerated, not embellished, invented. And here's the detail that makes this episode different from every other one on this channel. Usually, when we correct a myth, the movie is the one that took liberties with a true story someone else lived. This time, the person who lived the supposed true story may be the one who invented it, decades before a studio ever optioned the rights. Hold on to that, because by the end of this video, the question won't be what the movie got wrong about Frank Abagnale. It'll be whether there was ever a real story here to get right in the first place. Quick question before we start. How much of based on a true story do you think is actually true? Comment a percentage. We're about to check your math. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born April the 27th, 1948 in the Bronx, New York. That part isn't in dispute. Almost everything that comes next is. Status? Confirmed. Birth details per public and biographical record. By his own telling, published decades later in a best-selling memoir, Abagnale's parents divorced when he was a teenager, and the shock of it sent him spiraling into a life of forged checks and stolen identities almost overnight, a photographic memory, a fake ID, and a plan to become, in his own words, whoever he needed to be that day. It's a great story. Broken home, brilliant kid, one bad decision spiraling into a legend. It's also, according to the people who've spent the most time checking it, mostly unverifiable. Not because records from the 1960s are hard to find, but because when investigators went looking, the paper trail kept not matching the narrative. A journalist named Alan Logan spent years trying to find out how much of it actually happened. The debunking didn't start with Logan. It started decades earlier, and almost nobody outside 2 newsrooms ever heard about it. In 1978, a reporter named Stephen Hall at the San Francisco Chronicle looked into Abagnale's growing public story and found holes big enough to drive a stolen check through. Around the same time, a reporter named Ira Perry at the Daily Oklahoman did something close to a line-by-line audit, checking specific claims, including that Abagnale had recruited college students at the University of Arizona to fly around Europe on Pan Am's dime, and that he'd personally stolen $2.5 million before he was old enough to legally rent a car. Both stories ran. Both stories found real problems. And both stories went almost nowhere because this was 1978. No internet, no searchable archive, just 2 regional papers printing the truth in cities Frank Abagnale wasn't currently visiting. He kept touring. He kept talking. And a year earlier, in 1977, he'd already landed the appearance that changed everything. A spot on the nationally televised game show To Tell the Truth, presenting himself as a reformed con man with an incredible story. The next year, he was sitting across from Johnny Carson. Think about what those 2 platforms actually do to a story. A newspaper investigation asks you to sit with nuance, cross-check dates, read past the headline. A game show and a late-night couch ask you to do the opposite. Just enjoy the ride, laugh at the punchline, take the charming guest at his word because the format itself isn't built for skepticism. Abagnale didn't just get lucky with the venue. He picked the venue that couldn't fact-check him even if it wanted to. 2 small-town newspapers can't compete with primetime television. That's not a coincidence. That's the entire business model. Here's what the record can actually support. Stripped down to what's confirmed rather than performed. Frank Abagnale did commit check fraud as a young man. He did serve time for it, but the timeline itself works against the legend. According to Abagnale's own later account and public prison records, he was only out of prison for roughly 14 months total between the ages of 16 and 21. The exact window his memoir claims held a multi-continent, multi-identity crime spree. What the confirmed record does support is smaller and honestly, still a real crime, check fraud, committed by a young man in his late teens, serious enough to result in actual prosecution and actual prison time in multiple states. That part isn't in dispute anywhere. He wasn't an innocent man smeared by an overzealous journalist. He was a real check forger whose real, provable crimes were apparently not dramatic enough on their own to build a 5-decade media career on. 14 months? Not 4 years. not $2.5 million in 17,000 forged checks across 26 countries. 14 months, most of it presumably spent doing what people on the run from check fraud actually do: moving quickly, staying quiet, not booking international flights under a fake captain's uniform. It's worth being precise about why that math matters so much. 17,000 forged checks isn't just a big number for a movie poster. It works out to roughly 40 separate forged checks every single day, without a break, for over a year straight, all while allegedly also training as a pilot, studying for a bar exam, and touring Europe, even granting every possible benefit of the doubt about his talent. The logistics alone stretch past what a single unsupervised teenager could plausibly execute without ever appearing in a surviving arrest record that matches the claimed pace. Do the math yourself. It's the same math Ira Perry was doing in 1978. The single most famous image from this entire story is the fake Pan Am pilot. The crisp uniform, the wings on the chest, the confident walk through an airport nobody questions. It's the poster. It's the whole brand. According to the investigative record, Abagnale did impersonate an airline pilot, briefly, after his release from prison in late 1968, not during some sprawling teenage crime wave, but afterward as an adult, and by most documented accounts, for a few weeks, primarily with TWA, not Pan Am. A few weeks, one airline, not the glamorous one from the movie poster. That's the entire empire the myth was built on. And worth noting, this wasn't even during the supposed teenage crime spree. He was already an adult, already out of prison once, doing something closer to a short-lived post-release scheme than a multi-year international operation carried out by a criminal mastermind still in his teens. The doctor story doesn't hold up much better. Journalists investigating a supposed stint impersonating a physician in Georgia have found no solid documentation that it ever happened the way it's told. The lawyer story is worse. Reporters have found no evidence Abagnale ever sat for the Louisiana bar exam at all, let alone passed it. After 8 weeks of self-study using a supposed photographic memory, the detail the memoir leans on hardest to sell the genius angle. The professor claim doesn't survive contact with a records request either. Abagnale's memoir describes a stint teaching sociology at Brigham Young University, a claim that has similarly never been backed by employment records, class rosters, or colleagues willing to confirm it on the record. Pilot, doctor, lawyer, professor, 4 costumes, one at a time, each one repeated in interview after interview for 50 years. Investigators have been able to independently verify approximately none of them at the scale claimed. None of this stopped the memoir. If anything, the memoir is where the story stopped being fact-checked at all and started being sold as entertainment. First, as a best-selling book, then, in 2002, as a Steven Spielberg film starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. Alan Logan wasn't a true crime hobbyist chasing a viral theory. He's a science journalist by trade, the kind of writer whose entire career depends on being able to trace a claim back to its actual source and show his work. When he first started pulling the thread on Abagnale's story, according to his own later interviews, he expected to find an exaggerated but basically real account. What he found instead, the deeper he dug into court dockets and prison intake paperwork, was a timeline that simply didn't have room in it for the crimes it was supposedly famous for. The film's FBI agent character, the one chasing Abagnale across state lines for years, was loosely inspired by an actual federal investigator. How much of that extended cat-and-mouse relationship the film depicts as accurate is itself part of the same disputed record. One more layer of a story where almost nothing survives contact with a public document. Here's the part that should stop you cold. This isn't a case of Hollywood dramatizing a true story for runtime. Alan Logan's 2020 book, built on prison records, court documents, police reports, newspaper archives, and interviews with people who actually knew Abagnale, reached a conclusion sharper than dramatized. Logan's research found that the vast majority of Abagnale's claimed criminal history, the imposter career, the years of impersonation, the multi-million-dollar fraud, was fabricated, and that Abagnale spent most of his supposed criminal peak years in prison, not in airline cockpits. What makes Logan's work different from the two 1970s newspaper stories isn't just the passage of time, it's the sheer volume of paper behind it. Prison intake records, court dockets, parole files, contemporary newspaper archives from the actual years the crime supposedly happened, cross-referenced against the version of events Abagnale started telling only after he'd already become famous for telling it. When a story changes shape, depending on which decade you catch the interview in, that's not memory fading. That's a narrative still being built. The movie didn't take a true story and polish it for the screen. By the best available evidence, it took a fabricated memoir and treated the fabrication as source material. 2 layers of fiction, wearing one very convincing uniform. Whatever actually happened in those 14 months, the version Abagnale sold turned into one of the most durable second acts in American celebrity. He built a decades-long career as a security consultant and motivational speaker, telling corporations and government agencies how a con man thinks, cashing in on exactly the reputation the newspapers had already tried to puncture in 1978. For decades, his pitch to corporate audiences was essentially unfalsifiable by design. Trust me, because I used to be the very thing I'm now warning you about. It's a genuinely effective business model. The only qualification required to sell fraud prevention expertise as a former fraudster is that people believe you actually were one at the scale you claim. And for 50 years, mostly nobody outside 2 regional newsrooms bothered to check. For years, one of the organizations that trusted that reputation was AARP, which used Abagnale as a public face for fraud prevention education aimed at older Americans. A strange irony, considering the entire foundation of his own public story was, by the best evidence available, itself a fraud that had gone unpunctured for decades. That relationship ended. By 2022, AARP had published its own acknowledgement that many of Abagnale's tales had been debunked, and the association quietly wound down. Even people who worked closely with him for years eventually said so out loud. Mark Zinder, Abagnale's own speaking agent for a long stretch of that career, later called him, in his own words, a 2-bit criminal, and said he was embarrassed to have ever been associated with him. Zinder didn't just walk away quietly either. He went on record, by name, willing to have his own reputation tied to the statement. That's a different category of source than an anonymous tip or a rival's speculation. That's someone who spent years cashing checks of his own off the same story, deciding the reputational cost of staying silent had finally outweighed the paycheck. That's not a rival journalist with an axe to grind. That's the man who spent years standing next to him at the podium, cashing checks of his own off the same story. When Alan Logan's book came out in 2020, laying out years of documented research, contradicting the foundation of Abagnale's entire public identity, Abagnale's response was one sentence: "I have not read the book, nor do I think it is worthy of a comment." Consider what that sentence actually is. Not a denial, not a defense, not a single specific fact disputed. A man who built 50 years of income on the public believing an extraordinary personal story declined to engage with the one piece of journalism built specifically to check it. Compare that to how an innocent person typically responds to a serious public accusation, usually with specifics, with counter-evidence, with outrage at being misrepresented. Silence dressed up as indifference is its own kind of answer. Even his own IQ, the number of 136 that gets repeated in nearly every profile and introduction before his speeches, has never been independently verified by any released test result. It's just another number. In a story built almost entirely out of numbers nobody outside Frank Abagnale has ever been able to confirm. Stack all of it side by side. The check total, the pilot uniform, the bar exam, the professorship, the IQ score, and a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with any individual claim being true or false in isolation. Every single unverifiable detail happens to point the same direction, upward, smarter, richer, more accomplished, more impossible to catch. That's not how memory typically distorts over decades. That's how a personal brand gets built, one flattering embellishment at a time, by someone who understood exactly which details would make the best story. Here's what the movie got right, and it's a strange thing to say about a film this loosely tethered to fact. It captured the performance perfectly. The confidence, the costumes, the ability to talk his way into a room nobody should have let him into. Whatever the real scale of his crimes, the character trait at the center of the film, a man who could convince you of almost anything with enough charm and a straight face, appears to have been entirely real, and arguably the only part of the legend that's held up under 50 years of scrutiny. It's worth being fair about the film itself here too. Spielberg and his writers were adapting a published best-selling memoir, the standard, reasonable source material any studio would option. Nothing about their process was reckless by the normal standards of the industry. The failure that made this episode possible happened decades earlier in newsrooms that printed the truth and got ignored, not on a studio lot in the early 2000s. Here's what it got wrong, and this is the part that makes this episode different from almost anything else on this channel. Most based on a true story, films compress a real timeline, invent a few scenes, soften an ending. This one may have adapted a source that was never true in the first place, not embellished, but built detail by detail by the one person with the most to gain from everyone believing it, which raises the actual question worth sitting with. This channel exists to show you what movies changed about true stories. This might be the one time the more accurate title would have been based on a true storyteller, because the extraordinary con here was never the checks, or the uniform, or the fake diploma. Think about the mechanics of what actually had to happen for this to work for 50 straight years. A story gets told once, on a low-stakes game show, to an audience primed to be entertained rather than skeptical. It survives one round of local newspaper scrutiny that never reaches national attention. It gets locked into permanent form as a best-selling memoir, which publishers are not typically in the business of fact-checking against prison intake records. And then it gets adapted by one of the most respected directors in the world, which, fairly or not, launders any remaining public doubt through sheer production value. Nobody along that chain was necessarily acting in bad faith. The system just wasn't built to catch this particular kind of lie, and Frank Abagnale, whatever else is true about him, understood that system better than almost anyone who's ever tried to exploit it. It was 50 years of getting an entire country, twice, to stop asking for proof. Next case file is already in the works. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.